Have you ever wondered how a father could be rich enough to buy the whole world, yet not know how to hold his own son? Or how a simple gesture, like kneeling down to lift a child, could completely transform the heart of a man who had long hidden behind the gates of wealth? Today's story doesn't begin in a luxury mansion, but in a small cafe called Sunlight Café, where a waitress named Clara did something no one had ever done before. She knelt down, looked into the eyes of a disabled little boy and asked, "Would you like me to carry you to the garden if you want?" That seemingly simple act opened the door to the deepest change in the life of billionaire Alexander Rowen, a man who thought he had everything, but was unknowingly losing the one thing that mattered most, a true connection with his own son. If you believe that the right hug at the right time can heal even the most broken parts of the soul, hit subscribe and stay with us until the end, because this story's ending will make you reflect on love, presence, and what really matters in life. Part 1. Sunset over the first cup of cocoa late afternoon in the suburbs of Aspen. The last golden rays of sunlight tilted across snow-covered porches, casting a warm hue over the cobblestone path in front of Sunlight Café, a small, rustic coffee shop that felt as cozy as a mother's hand. There were no $10 lattes here, no celebrity regulars, but there was laughter from children, the gentle scent of fresh pastries, and something rarely spoken of, quiet peace that didn't need to announce itself. Clara Lively, with her hastily tied hair and soft, observant eyes, was straightening the cloth napkins on the tables. She wasn't strikingly beautiful, not in the way magazines define it, but there was something about her presence that made people want to linger, as if her every movement carried a memory everyone had touched once: kindness. At that moment, a luxury SUV rolled slowly to a stop in front of the cafe. Stepping out was Alexander Rowen, a quiet billionaire known for multi-million-dollar deals and an aversion to cameras. By his side was 6-year-old Elias, a boy with congenital muscle weakness, thin and silent, like a winter leaf waiting to fall. Alexander wasn't the type of man who walked into small-town cafes on quiet winter days. But today was different. Maybe it was because Elias had whispered something when he saw the hand-painted word sunlight. Or maybe, without saying it out loud, Alexander himself needed something warmer than the cold marble walls of his estate. They chose the table by the window, where the last rays of the day pierced the fogged-up glass. Elias said nothing. He simply watched Clara, the only waitress on shift, with eyes that held no fear, but also no hope. Clara gently placed 2 mugs of hot cocoa on the table. No fuss, no questions, no pity, just a smile and a soft, simple line. "Careful now, this cup might just warm your whole day." Alexander looked up, for the first time really seeing a stranger without putting his guard up. Because in the way Clara spoke to his son, there was no pity, only quiet understanding. And perhaps that was exactly what Elias needed. Part 2. The nameless embrace. The next day, Alexander hadn't planned to return to Sunlight Café, but Elias, his voice barely above a whisper, said, "Dad, can we sit at the same spot as yesterday?" It was the first time in months that the boy had initiated anything. And so Alexander, the man known for sealing multi-million-dollar deals with a firm nod, nodded this time with surprising gentleness. Clara was still there, wearing the same slightly worn but spotless apron, her smile soft like the morning breeze. She didn't ask any questions when she saw them return. She simply chose the same table as before, and this time brought an extra cushion to support Elias's back. The boy looked at her with wide, curious eyes. "You remembered me?" he asked, his voice as fragile as a falling leaf in a quiet room. Clara smiled. "I remembered those bright eyes, the way you drank your hot chocolate without spilling a drop, and the little nod you gave me as you left." Alexander looked up at the young server, the woman who, in just 2 brief encounters, had done what he'd struggled to do for years: make his son feel safe enough to open up. Not because she had all the right words, but because she listened, with her eyes. Lunch passed peacefully. Elias finished his sandwich, something that hadn't happened in weeks. When Clara brought out a small cookie, Elias didn't reach for it like usual. Instead, he leaned forward, and gently wrapped his arms around her. No words, no prompting, just a simple hug, one that anyone with a heart would understand. The hug of feeling safe. Clara froze for just a heartbeat. Then she knelt down and embraced him with both arms. Not too tight, not overly delicate, just enough. As if she knew exactly what the boy needed. No more, no less. Alexander turned his face away, as if something unfamiliar had touched a place inside him he'd long kept hidden. In his mind, he saw his late wife, the only person who had ever known how to hold their son just right. And now, a stranger had done it. A coffee shop girl, with small hands, clear eyes, and a heart that had never once asked for anything in return. Part 3. A strange request from a silent father. Since that lunch, Alexander hadn't been able to sleep. The stacks of contracts on his desk, the Zoom meetings stretching late into the night, everything had faded into a quiet blur. All that remained in his mind was the image of Elias resting his head on the shoulder of the young woman from the little cafe, smiling so softly it hurt to remember. A week later, he returned to Sunlight Café. Elias wasn't with him this time. It was just Alexander, dressed in a charcoal gray overcoat, his eyes tired but deeply focused. Clara was wiping down the counter when she looked up and saw him walk in. "Mr. Hammond?" she said, surprised. "Is Elias doing all right?" Alexander nodded, silent for a few moments before stepping toward the counter. He placed a cream-colored envelope on the surface, his name embossed in elegant lettering. A. Hammond Holdings. Beneath it, in delicate handwriting, were the words, "Not an invitation. Just a thought." Clara glanced at the envelope, then back at him. "I'm not here for the coffee," Alexander said, his voice low and deliberate. "I came to thank you, but I'm not very good at that." She offered a quiet smile and said nothing. "I want to invite you to my home this weekend," he continued, speaking slowly, as if weighing every word. "Not to work, not to care for Elias, not to fix anything, just to be there. To sit with him like you did. No expectations." Clara didn't respond right away. Her eyes flickered with a mix of curiosity and caution. Not because he was a billionaire, but because the request itself was so unexpected. She had met people with money before. They often asked for too much, offered generous pay, but lacked the one thing that mattered most: genuine intent. But Alexander was different. She saw it in his eyes once hardened by business, now trembling because of something so simple. He wanted to learn how to be a father. "All right," Clara said, her voice as gentle as a breath. "As long as Elias wants me to come." Alexander nodded. And on his face, for the first time in years, appeared a small smile. Not born of success, but of something even more powerful. Hope. Part 4. Afternoons in the wordless garden. Alexander's garden had once been a picture of perfection. Carefully paved stone paths, vibrant rows of hydrangeas, and a wooden swing hung between two towering maple trees. But ever since his wife passed away, the garden had grown silent, like a page in a book that was never meant to be turned. And then, Clara began coming every weekend. She brought nothing but a simple cloth tote, a few picture books for children, and a single red apple. At first, Elias remained hesitant, peeking from behind the glass doors, watching Clara from afar as if she were some kind of test. But by her third visit, he opened the door, gently touched her hand, and whispered, "Will you push me on the swing?" The swing, once silenced by time and dust, creaked gently again through the garden air. Elias sat there, his tousled hair swaying with the breeze, giggling softly. Clara sat nearby, not saying much, simply drawing quiet circles in the dirt with a dry twig. They shared that silence like a private language, without words, yet profoundly understood. Alexander watched from his second-floor window. He didn't step outside, didn't interrupt. He stood there quietly, like a stranger listening to the soundtrack of a life he once knew. And every time Elias laughed, it was as if someone gently tapped on his heart. Not painful, just deeply stirring. One afternoon, Clara brought colored paper and showed Elias how to fold paper airplanes. Bright paper gliders swooped through the garden, diving into flower beds, landing on soft grass, and each time they did, Elias burst into delighted laughter as if discovering some grand secret of the universe. "When I grow up," Elias said one day, suddenly serious, "I want to be someone who makes airplanes fly really far." Clara didn't laugh. She simply replied, "And I believe you can do that as long as you're not afraid when the wind changes." That evening, Alexander sat alone on the balcony, a cooling cup of tea in his hand. Inside him, something was beginning to shift, a feeling that was soft, delicate, but quietly growing. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about work or remembering board meetings. He was thinking about Elias's tiny hands, about those colorful paper planes, and about a quiet girl who had somehow brought light back to a garden he'd long forgotten. Part 5, a jealousy born of memory, and a silent goodbye. There are jealousies that don't stem from love, but from something one has lost. Alexander sat in his study as the setting sun poured through the tall glass windows, casting the silhouette of Clara pushing Elias's wheelchair along the winding garden path. The boy was laughing, a pure, unguarded laugh Alexander had rarely heard since his mother passed. His hand tightened slightly around the coffee cup. Not out of resentment, but because he had brushed against something he had never dared name. A quiet ache, like someone who suddenly feels like a stranger in his own home. The evening before, as he passed through the hallway, he had overheard something that twisted his heart in ways he hadn't expected. "If Mom were still alive, I think she'd carry me like Miss Clara does," Elias had said. The boy didn't know his father stood just beyond the door and had heard every word. Clara didn't respond. She simply kissed the boy gently on the head and pulled him into her arms. No explanations, no justifications. But somehow, her silence made Alexander feel like the outsider. That night, he didn't sleep. He wandered the halls, as though searching for something that had quietly slipped away. And by morning, he had made a decision. To reduce Clara's working hours, to limit her visits, to end the spontaneous moments that had once felt so natural. There were no goodbyes, no conversations. Only a few terse lines in a letter passed along through the housekeeper. When Clara returned that Saturday, she sensed the shift immediately. The gate, once open and quiet welcome, now remained closed. There was no Alexander, no soft smile waiting on the porch. Only Elias, still with those bright eyes, still with those small outstretched arms reaching for her. Clara didn't ask anything. She just smiled faintly, knelt down like always, and wrapped Elias in her arms. But that day, something hung in the air, like a pane of glass separating them from the garden that had once burst with sunlight. She could feel a gaze from the upstairs window, cold, distant, tangled in its own confusion. At home, Clara placed her cloth bag quietly on the table. She didn't cry, but something in her gaze had dimmed. She took out a small sheet of paper and wrote only one line. "That boy doesn't need me to carry him. He just needs someone brave enough to kneel and say, 'I'm here if you're tired.'" And she left, without knowing if anyone would read it or keep those words in their heart. Part 6. An awakening through silent fractures. Some nights aren't sleepless because of turmoil, but because the heart, though still, senses something is missing. Since Clara left, the house had become too quiet. No more soft footsteps on the wooden floor. No gentle laughter drifting from the backyard. Only the ticking of the clock echoed through the walls, as if reminding Alexander that time waits for no one. Elias, however, changed in a different way. He grew quiet, not fussy, not playful. And what broke Alexander's heart even more was this. Elias didn't ask about Clara. It was as if the child already understood that some questions have no answers, and so he chose silence. That evening, as Alexander passed Elias's room, he paused at the slightly ajar door. Inside, the boy was sitting alone by the window, clutching a threadbare teddy bear. He whispered something, soft, almost inaudible. Alexander stepped in quietly. "What are you saying, son?" he asked, softening his tone. Elias didn't turn around. He simply replied, "If Miss Clara were here, she'd sit with me until I fell asleep." Alexander said nothing. His heart twisted. That simple sentence pierced straight through all the layers he had built over the years. From the day his wife died to every demanding board meeting since, he had believed that what he gave Elias, money, doctors, comfort, was enough. But now, in his son's eyes, he saw what truly mattered: presence, an embrace. Someone willing to sit beside him, not out of duty, not from obligation, but from love. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He reopened Clara's note, the one-line message that had been left quietly but struck like a blade to the softest part of his soul. That boy doesn't need me to carry him. He just needs someone brave enough to kneel and say, "I'm here if you're tired." Alexander sat upright. He hesitated no longer. He was no longer afraid of being compared to the woman he had lost, no longer obsessed with controlling what he didn't yet understand. He knew now it was time to learn how to kneel. The next morning, he left the estate, not to meet lawyers, not for a board meeting, but to go where Clara now worked. A small community therapy center tucked into a modest neighborhood. He brought nothing with him, no contracts, no grand gestures, just a heart full of regret and an apology that had waited far too long to be spoken. Part 7. The first embrace and a new beginning. That afternoon, the city sky was painted in a deep shade of amber. The last light of day slipped quietly through the windows of Heartward Therapy Center, where Clara now spent each morning listening to children who simply needed to be heard. Alexander stood at the modest front gate, still holding the note Clara once left behind. He brought no gifts, no rehearsed words, only an unguarded heart, finally learning how to open after years of being sealed shut. He stepped inside, leather shoes tapping gently against the faded tile floor. Children played in the courtyard. A little boy in a wheelchair beamed with laughter as Clara bent down to retie his shoelaces. That image, simple, sincere, and achingly beautiful, blurred Alexander's vision without warning. Clara looked up when she saw him. The surprise in her eyes quickly softened into calm. She didn't rush to stand, didn't avert her gaze. She simply asked, gently, "Are you here for Elias or for yourself?" Alexander walked closer slowly. "I used to think I was strong because I could control everything," he said. "But it turns out, the bravest thing is knowing when to kneel." In that moment, they said nothing more. Every explanation felt unnecessary when sincerity was already written in their eyes. Clara gave a quiet nod, and Alexander knew she had forgiven him. That evening, Alexander came home earlier than usual. Elias was sitting on the living room rug, arms wrapped around his worn teddy bear, eyes distant. But when he saw his father kneel down and open his arms, the boy hesitated for a second, then ran into the embrace like a sapling reaching for sunlight. For the first time in years, Alexander held his son, not out of duty, not to reassure onlookers, but because his own heart needed healing too. His arms trembled slightly, but the warmth was undeniable. Elias whispered in his ear, "Dad, you know how to hold me now." The next morning, Clara returned to the estate. But this time, not as a hired visitor, rather as a friend, a part of the family. She wasn't tentative, wasn't being supervised. She walked in and was welcomed by Elias's grateful eyes and Alexander's sunlit smile. And just like that, a new chapter began. Not written in contracts, but in embraces. Not bound by control, but by presence. They hadn't changed the world, but they had done something far more miraculous. They had changed a heart. And then, when Alexander walked out into the garden and saw his son sitting there, quietly hugging a worn-out teddy bear and whispering, "If Miss Clara were still here, she wouldn't have put me down so soon," his heart broke wide open. In that moment, he realized that all these years, he hadn't lacked money or power. He'd only lacked the courage to hold his son with his whole heart. Clara never tried to replace anyone. She was simply there, with open arms, ready to hold a child when the world had worn him down. And that quiet presence changed a little boy, a father, and a family, forever. You know, not everyone needs to be lifted high. Sometimes, they just need someone patient enough to kneel down beside them and say, "I'm here if you need me." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like, share the moment that moved you the most in the comments, and hit subscribe to stay with us for more stories where quiet kindness always takes center stage.